Oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good, and his mercy endures forever. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, and we thank God for blessing us to see one more day. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you take a look at this broadcast. It's Friday, and on Fridays we spend time in a motivational message that deals with fundamentals of faith, introducing individuals to what we believe in churches of Christ and reminding members of churches of Christ of what we believe and what we teach. I remember a time when individuals would ask about the Church of Christ and wanted to know some distinguishing marks of churches of Christ, or what do we do in churches of Christ. And then on some websites or some brochures, we would put what to expect when you visit a worship service at a Church of Christ. And that was a positive statement. So I want to approach this in a positive way. What can you expect when you visit an assembly of a Church of Christ? I remember a time when we would share the 5 items of worship, and two of the distinguishing features of our worship was the weekly observance of the Lord's Supper and the absence of instruments in our worship service. And so those were some of the marks or some of the uh, red flags that people would point at. Well, we noticed that you took the Lord's Supper and it wasn't the first Sunday or the third Sunday of the month. And we noticed that there were no choirs and there were no instruments of music in our worship. And we would have a good dialogue. We would have good discussions with individuals about those two things. I briefly just want to share about the non-use of instruments in the worship services of Churches of Christ. We have some scholars in our brotherhood who have written material on it, and I like to read that. I highly recommend. Everett Ferguson is one of those scholars who have written extensively on a cappella music in the public worship of the church. That's actually the title of one of his works, one of his books, and I'm reading from the fourth edition. And I just want to read just some excerpts from Brother Ferguson, Dr. Ferguson, about this. In chapter 3, he deals with doctrinal considerations. And he says, thus far, this study has shown that the circumstances of New Testament times and the testimony of church history point to a negative conclusion concerning the use of instrumental music in early Christian worship. And then he asked the question, was there some reason other than cultural or sociological for the absence of instrumental music in early Christian worship? And then what what Dr. Ferguson does is he turns to the doctrinal or theological aspect of the study. And he makes a strong argument, he makes a strong statement and says, I would argue that a cappella is singing without instruments. And Dr. Ferguson says, I would argue that a cappella music is more consistent with the nature of Christian worship. It is really the nature of Christian worship which determined early Christian practice and should determine present practice. And then he mentions there are doctrinal considerations which give meaning and significance to the biblical and historical evidence. Well, this is just a devotion, so I can't go into detail because it would take up too much time. But what Dr. Ferguson does under this chapter, he talks about the nature of worship, and he talks about spiritual worship. And he talks about edification. And I just want to mention briefly as we talk about what to expect when you visit a Church of Christ. When we talk about the nature of worship, worship is what a person offers to God. I'm reading from his book. What human beings offer to God in the assembly of the church should be expressive of the highest nature in human relationship with God. Human beings are rational creatures, and they come before God in a personal relationship. The assembly, among other things, is a service of praise, and Christians offer their highest and best to God. And then he talks about spiritual worship, and he uses John chapter 4 and verse number 24. He also mentions Romans chapter 12, verse 1. He talks. He also mentions First Peter chapter 2 and verse number 5. The assembly of the church exemplifies the spiritual relationship with God and the spiritual nature of all worship. There's a real question whether the offering of instrumental music is consistent with the spiritual nature of Christian worship. As a mechanical act, producing instrumental music is distinct from the offering of spiritual worship. That is what comes from the spiritual nature of humanity. Very interesting what Brother Ferguson, Dr. Ferguson has to say about what to expect when it comes to the worship service in the Church of Christ, and especially the non-use of instrumental music. Of course, Jesus Christ is the drawing power, and we believe that if we lift up Christ, that Christ will draw all men unto him. I'm somewhat biased because I just think a cappella music is beautiful. It is wonderful. There's no better sound under heaven when it comes to praise to God, when we lift up our voices in praise to God Almighty. And I remember the days that when we would invite people to our worship service, sometimes we would prep them and say, now, there's going to be something different here that you may not be accustomed to or used to. And I have never heard, I'm not saying it has not happened, but I've never heard anyone leave our worship service and not recognize or appreciate a cappella singing. I've never heard anyone say, y'all need instruments because y'all sounded bad. I've never heard that. Now, I'm not saying no one has ever said it. I'm just saying I've never heard it. Most people appreciate it, perhaps because it was novel to them, because it was something that they have never experienced before. But one of the distinguishing marks of churches of Christ is that we sing without instruments, the non-use of instruments. And another distinguishing mark is you're going to see the Lord's Supper observed every Lord's Day, every first day of the week. So on this Friday, I just wanted to remind members of the Church of Christ of why we do not use instruments of music, and using Dr. Ferguson's argument when we talk about spiritual worship, and when we talk about the nature of worship, he mentions that Christians present their bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. We're lively stones or living stones, which are built into a spiritual house. Christian worship is to be done in the spirit, and vocal expressions are peculiarly well suited to the expression of spiritual worship, to the expressing of what comes from the human spirit and through the Spirit of God. So let's take a positive approach. One of the things I learned from a great preacher who's gone on to glory is talk about the positives of the church. You don't have to talk about the negatives of other faiths, but just uplift what you do in the Lord's church. There's beauty in a cappella singing. There's joy in a cappella singing. It's not only does it sound good to the human ear, but it sounds good to God. Those of you who are in the Hopewell, Petersburg, Colonial Heights, Chester area, you see on the screen that we're giving out Mass on the 15th of August. Also, for those outside of this area and in this area, you see on the screen a webinar that's coming up on August the 15th. And we're looking forward to that. If you have not already done so, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, JMC Ministry YouTube channel. And that way you'll be one of the first people to know of upcoming events. And when we put out motivational messages or sermons, you'll be one of the first to be notified by subscribing to our YouTube channel. I want to thank you for tuning in on this Friday. And until next time, may the Lord bless you and may he bless you real good.